Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arvind Pandey. I am faculty at the School of Public Policy and Governance, Tata Institute of Social Science, Hyderabad. On behalf of our school, I welcome you all in our 64th Perspective Lecture. We are organizing a series of webinars as part of our Perspective Lecture series under a broader theme, which is after COVID, imagining new socio-economic orders. Today, we have invited the famous psychoanalyst and writer Dr. Sudhir Kakar to deliver a lecture on fostering humanness, some reflections. Dr. Kakar has been teaching and research faculty in various international and national institutions, including Harvard University, Harvard Business School, University of Chicago, Princeton University, University of Cologne, INSEAD France, IIM Ahmedabad, and IIT Delhi. His many honors include the Cardinal Award of Columbia University, Boyer Prize of the American Anthropological Association, Tagore Mark Award, Goethe Medal, Distinguished Service Award of Indo-American Psychiatric Association, Rockefeller Residency, MacArthur Fellowship, and the Order of the Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. Dr. Kakar is also author and editor of 23 books of non-fiction and 7 of fiction. His books have been translated in 22 languages around the world. Our today's webinar is basically, we have Discussant Dr. Vindhya Undurti. Dr. Vindhya is Professor of Psychology and presently Deputy Director, Tata Institute of Social Science, Hyderabad. Her research interests lie in the interface of psychology with feminism, focusing on gender-based violence, gender and mental health, feminist counseling, sex trafficking, psychology of women's political activism. She has published extensively on these topics, and her co-edited volume, Handbook of International Feminism, Perspectives on Psychology, Women, Culture, and Rights, won the 2012 Distinguished Publication Award from the Association for Women in Psychology. She is the recipient of several international fellowships, such as South Asian Visiting Scholarship at University of Oxford, Fulbright Visiting Lectureship in Evertus Leonard University, Hungary, and Gothenburg University, Sweden. She has also been extensively involved in gender sensitization workshops for industry, police, media, and publishing houses, corporate and non-governmental agencies and educational institutions across the country. Before inviting to our guest speaker, I would like to inform speakers, discussant, and our participants that this session is being recorded for our web channel. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Sudhir Kakar.
Thank you very much, Professor Pandey. It's a privilege addressing you and everyone gathered there. Good afternoon to everyone. This is my first webinar. I have 2-3 lined up in the next 2 months. So I thought I wouldn't be nervous before speaking, but this is the first time it is a webinar, and I'm quite nervous in the sense of without any feedback coming from the audience. Normally one modulates, unconsciously notices when people start coughing or the feet start shuffling that you're boring them. How do I know whether I'm boring or not? But we'll go ahead and do that. Okay. Since we have just marked the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, I would like to begin my talk on humaneness by first line of Gandhi's favorite bhajan, Vaishnav jan to tene kahiye, je peer parai jane re. For me, it is the Vaishnav Jan in Narsi Mehta's famous bhajan, who is the embodiment of humaneness, the person who understands the other's pain. The primary marker of humaneness is then sympathy. I use sympathy as an overarching concept that includes its many manifestations: fellow feeling, feeling of kinship that extend to the non-human world, compassion, and empathy, where we not only feel for and feel with, but also feel into the other. Sympathy is not limited to human beings, but extends to the natural world. Here, Tagore and Gandhi are in complete agreement. Brotherhood, Gandhi writes in one letter, is just now a distant aspiration. To me, it is a test of true spirituality. All our prayers and observances are empty nothings, so long as we do not feel a live kinship with all life. To one of his many critics, and there were many throughout the life and even after his death, who wrote to him suggesting that violence is the law of nature and that man is animal first and human afterwards, Gandhi replies that man can be classed as animal only so long as he retains his humanity, and goes on to say, the correspondent apologizes for suggesting that I might regard myself as a remote cousin of the ape. The truth is that my ethics not only permit me, but require me to own kinship with not merely the ape, but the horse and the sheep, the lion and the leopard, the snake and the scorpion. The hard ethics which rule my life, and I hold ought to rule the life of every man and woman, impose this unilateral obligation upon us. Here, Gandhi is in the tradition of some of the greatest Indian icons: Buddha in ancient India, Kabir and Nanak in medieval North India, Tukaram in Maharashtra, Baswa in Karnataka, Narsi Mehta in Gujarat, the Tamil saints, and Gandhi's contemporary Rabindranath Tagore in modern India, who have held that sympathy is the supreme value of our civilization. For Tagore, for instance, in contrast to the West, Indian civilization sought to establish a relation with the world, with nature, as also with living beings, not through the cultivation of power, but the fostering of sympathy. And I quote him here, when we know this world as alien to us, then its mechanical aspect takes prominence in our mind. And then we set up our machines and our methods to deal with it and make as much profit as our knowledge of its mechanism allows us to do so. This view of things does not play us false. This aspect of truth cannot be ignored. It has to be known and mastered. Europe has done so and reaped a rich harvest. For us, the highest purpose of this world is not merely living in it, knowing it, and making use of it, but realizing our own selves in it through expansion of our sympathy, not alienating ourselves from it and dominating it, but comprehending and uniting it with ourselves in perfect union. Tagore firmly believed that the wholesale acceptance of modern Western education has suppressed this fundamental quality of the Indian mind. It has been treated like a wooden library shelf to be loaded with volumes of second-hand information. I quote him again, in consequence, he means the Indian mind, has lost its own color and character and has borrowed polish from the carpenter's shop. We have bought our spectacles at the expense of our eyesight. Indian and Western are, of course, not monolithic categories, but only refer to the dominant strands in the imaginations of the two civilizations. Tagore, I believe, is not suggesting a simplified dichotomy between Indian and Western views. In the West too, there have been thinkers, for example, Edmund Burke and Adam Smith in the Anglo-Saxon world, the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer in the German-speaking one, who famously proclaimed that compassion is the basis of all morality, who too have shared the traditional Indian civilizational value of sympathy, love in its most elevated form, as indispensable to social cohesion and solidarity. And we are all familiar with the famous slogan of the French Revolution, now a universal aspiration: liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. It is interesting to note that fraternity, brotherhood, occupies the last place in this short list, and indeed has become muted, if not sidelined, in contemporary Western discourse. I must also note that, with the exception of saints like Saint Francis, who has said to have addressed even a wolf as brother wolf, the dominant current of Western thought since the last 200 years has confined brotherhood, sympathy to one's own group, and not extended it beyond its borders to other human beings, not to speak of other species. In our fascination with Western intellectual gurus, from Karl Marx to Michel Foucault, we do not realize how much space the Western idea of the role of power in institutions and society has to come to occupy in modern Indian mind. Again, this is not to reject the value of the role of power and the truth it contains, but in Tagore's spirit, seek to assimilate this truth with our own heritage on the primacy of sympathy. What Tagore objected to was not Western ideas and a worldview that foregrounds the role of power in human relations, but the disproportional space they occupy in our minds, and thus kill or hamper the opportunity to create a new combination of truths. I quote him again: "It is this which makes me urge that all the elements in our own culture have to be strengthened, not to resist the Western culture, but truly accept and assimilate it, to use it for our sustenance, not as our burden, to get mastery over this culture and not to live on its outskirts as the hewers of texts and drawers of book learning." Unlike Gandhi, Tagore welcomed modern science and Western forms of knowledge. He admired the fullness of intellectual vigor in the West that is working towards the solution of all problems of life. What he bemoans is that the mental vitality of modern forms of knowledge are not balanced by the traditional Indian idea of the cultivation of sympathy. To take some examples of such a possible balancing, what would it look like? How would sympathy affect the goal of modern psychotherapy, for instance, specifically my own discipline of psychoanalysis? The goal of psychoanalysis is to lead to an outcome where the person, through an increased self-understanding, by making the unconscious conscious, attains a freedom to love, work, and play, free from inhibitions her mind has gathered over the life cycle, especially from the childhood years. In other words, it is liberty from inner inhibitions, which is the highest goal of psychoanalytic therapy. Is this sufficient as a goal? From the viewpoint of sympathy, fraternity, or brotherhood, we would need to view psychoanalysis as a transforming quest for self-knowledge that not only frees us from the internal inhibitions, but extends the range of our sympathy. A successful analysis would then be one that leads to self-understanding and growth of a wisdom that enriches our life with meaning and motivates us to act beyond our narrow interest. It will not be content with reaching the Freudian ideal of the autonomous individual, but view it as a stepping stone to the caring individual. Let me take one hypothetical example: the treatment of a patient suffering from anhedonia, the condition where one finds no pleasure in any activity, however intrinsically pleasurable the activity may be. In this other conception of psychoanalysis, the therapeutic goal will not only be a restoration of, say, sexual pleasure, but a restoration that takes place under the guiding star of loving intimacy, the form of sympathy in this context. In such an analysis, the pleasure of eating will not be restored only for itself, but under the star of fellowship, the form of sympathy in this context, which turns even a simple meal into a feast, a celebration of solidarity with others who share it. Narcissism, whose pathological forms are the chief obstacles to the cultivation of sympathy, would assume a central place in both clinical and theoretical explorations. My emphasis on the desirability of a caring, compassionate person as the outcome of psychoanalytic therapy is not because of any subscription to religious moral prescriptions or secular ideologies, but because of recognition of the nature of human reality, namely that each one of us is deeply embedded with other human beings as also connected to animate and inanimate nature, an order that is only kept from breaking down by humaneness. To take another example, this one from the study of literature, have we sufficiently explored the basic assumptions that lie behind Western theories of literary criticism and judgment of literary worth, which we use in the teaching of literature in our Indian colleges and universities? Do they need to be balanced, or at least also to be looked at from the angle of sympathy, which I've postulated as the defining feature of the idea of India? A hint of the possibilities is again provided by Tagore in his remarks on Shakespeare, who he greatly admired, and Kalidas, who he revered. Quote, "The fury of passion in two of Shakespeare's youthful poems is exhibited in conspicuous isolation. It is snatched away, naked from the context of all. It has not the green earth or the blue sky around it. It is there ready to bring to our view the raging fever which is in man's desires, and not the balm of health and repose which encircles it in the universe." As I understand him, Indian literary criticism will pay as much attention to the movement of sympathy in a work of literature as, following Western canons, it does to the movement of passions. The characters in the Hindi writer Premchand's fiction, or for that matter Tagore's, for example, may not plumb the depths of human passions, a shortcoming that from the Indian point of view is relieved and compensated by the exquisite movement of sympathy that characterizes the best of these works. The highest accolades will of course be reserved for literary works that combine both the movements. Some of Tolstoy's writings come immediately to my mind. My third example is from social movements. Social movements in service of justice for the weak and the oppressed are rapidly picking up pace in our country, shaking traditional hierarchies and power structures. This is a very welcome development. Most of these movements, however, seem to operate on the basis of only one ethic, justice, which is related to the issue of power, of correcting skewed and unfair power relations among social groups. What they highlight is the primacy of equality in the liberté, égalité, fraternity trio of the French revolutionary slogan. In an almost sacralized ethic of justice, what matters is the outcome, not the path. Thus, there have been eloquent voices that have defended violence in service of justice. In her reflections on violence, the philosopher Hannah Arendt writes, "Under certain circumstances, violence, which is to act without argument or speech and without reckoning with consequences, is the only possibility of settling the scales of justice right again. In this sense, rage and the violence that sometimes, not always, goes with it belongs to the natural emotions, and to cure man of them would mean nothing less than to dehumanize or emasculate him." I believe that the ethic of sympathy compassion in this context must also temper the quest for justice. In our quest to right a wrong, bring the ethic of justice to the forefront, we are in danger of losing sight of the defining characteristic we have been talking about. In Tagore's words, creative force needed for the true union in human society is love. Justice is only an accompaniment to it, like the beating of tom-tom to a song. Sympathy, then, the primary constituent of humaneness, is the highest manifestation of the human soul. Perhaps climbing the summit of sympathy, realizing the Upanishadic ideal of he who sees all beings in his own self and his own self in all beings, is only possible for evolved mystics and saints. One can compare the spiritual expedition of our life to a mountain climb with many base camps marking its progress on the way. The first camp, from which one cannot see the summit, covered as it is by clouds, though we know it is there, is tolerance, defined minimally as giving benefit of the doubt to others. The second camp, a little higher, can be said to be compassion, while the third and the last camp, from where one climbs to the summit, is empathy, the feeling into another person, although empathy, of course, can also encompass feeling into nature. The point is that the spiritual climb fosters deeper and deeper feelings of sympathy, although only a few rare souls can reach the summit. Most of us can consider ourselves fortunate if we are humane enough to catch a glimpse of the peak of sympathy from the base camps of tolerance, compassion, and empathy. Personally, I fully subscribe to Tagore's view that all our poetry, philosophy, science, literature, art, religion, society, and politics serve or must serve to widen the range of our kinship, the principle of the soul. Initiated in a love for those who nurtured us when we were children, and a love for our own children, friends, lovers as we get older, it is only the wider and wider manifestations of sympathy that are the true measure of human progress. The soul is insignificant as long as it is imprisoned within an individual self. It reveals its significance and its joy only in sympathetic connection with others. Actually, the more vigorous our individuality, the less the need to encase the individual self in an armor of self-centeredness, and more the capacity to make it permeable and thus participate in the play of what we call the soul. To me, the question of the fate of the soul after death, central to our religions, is not especially interesting. If we do not free the soul from its prison of individual self, guarded by warders of self-centeredness while alive, I doubt whether there is hope of its freedom, of its salvation after death. To adapt the American poet Robert Frost's observation on love, the earth is the only place for the soul. I don't know where it is likely to get better. Or as the German mystic Meister Eckhart observes, what the soul is in its ground, no one knows. But this we do know, that the soul is where God works compassion. If sympathy is the primary marker of humaneness, is there also a secondary marker? The answer is given in the next lines of Narsimha Mehta's bhajan. Para dukhe upakar kare to ye, mana abhiman na aaye nere. Helps others who are suffering without conceit entering the mind. In other words, altruistic behavior that is concerned with realizing the welfare of others is the secondary characteristic of humaneness. The development of sympathy is not sufficient by itself, but involves a responsibility for translating it into action in everyday life as also in society and its institutions. Both altruism and sympathy, on which it is based, have a troubled place in reigning currents of modern thought. Traditional economic theory, based on the premise of Homo economicus, acting rationally out of self-interest, selfishly, is as uneasy with altruistic behavior as is sociobiology with its belief in the selfish gene as essential to evolutionary success. But what if this dichotomy between narcissism and altruism, ahankar and upkar, is false? What if doing good to others is doing good to yourself? Indeed, I would suggest that altruism and egotism are not in conflict, but complementary to each other. Doing good to others is also doing good to yourself. Altruistic behavior may not only be vital for an individual's spiritual progress, but even for psychological well-being. It is not only a moral exhortation, but also an empirical fact. The Buddhists stated flatly, paying attention to one's own needs is a producer of suffering, cherishing others a giver of happiness. This advocacy of altruism is not an ideological stance underlined only by wise sayings, which may or may not be true, but very much a matter of empirical fact. And here, I'm not only talking of psychological well-being and happiness, which some may consider as vague categories, but of concrete physical health. The benefits of altruistic behavior are so large that they even show up in improved health and longer lifespan. In a large longitudinal study from the United States, those who reported giving more help and support to spouses, friends, and relatives went on to live longer than those who gave less, whereas the amount of help that people reported receiving showed no relationship to their longevity. In other words, it is indeed more blessed to give than receive. I often tell aspiring psychotherapists that they are entering a profession that may not be financially rewarding, but is one of the best antidepressants that I know. Indeed, research in social neurosciences suggests that sympathy and altruistic behavior that is motivated by sympathy may be wired into our brains. The experience of sympathetic altruism is accompanied by a host of feelings which neuroscientists have located in the brain area associated to positive emotions and where they are most strongly activated. Sympathetic altruism, one could say, is the most positive of positive emotions. And we are all aware that witnessing the pain of a stranger activates a similar pain network in our brains, the so-called mirror neurons, although this reaction almost disappears in men in contrast to women if the stranger is perceived to be a bad person. Physiological findings, besides those of neurosciences, also support the existence of deep roots of humaneness in humankind. To witness good deeds, altruistic behavior, gives rise to feelings of elation that are physiologically related to the rewarding release of the hormone oxytocin. In an ingenious experiment, the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt gathered 45 nursing mothers with their infants in a psychological laboratory where half were shown videos depicting altruistic behavior while the others watched comedy videos. Almost half the mothers who were shown the morally uplifting videos showed increased milk flow or nursed their babies after watching the video, while only very few mothers did so after watching the comedy deals. The first group also turned towards their babies more, touching them and clasping them to their breasts. Haidt comments that the effect was one of the biggest I ever saw. Psychologists Michael Tomasello and Felix Warneken discovered the presence of spontaneous help and cooperation readiness in small children as young as 18 months across cultures, which was not inculcated by an adult and was independent of any reward. Other experiments demonstrate the presence of altruistic behavior even in 2 to 3-year-old chimpanzees who spontaneously help a familiar adult who appears in some distress. I just mentioned the hormone oxytocin, popularly called the love drug or cuddle hormone, that rewards caring, altruistic behavior. It is the hormone that provides a powerful motivation to care for one's children, as also forge other kinds of bonds. It makes people trust others, and conversely, people who behave trustingly cause oxytocin levels to rise in the partner they trusted. Oxytocin levels rise in people who report feelings of wanting to help someone who is suffering. Our brains secrete more oxytocin when we have intimate contact with another person, even if that contact is a back massage. Whereas the release of oxytocin in the brain is the physiological basis for why human beings are a caring lot, evolutionary biology would explain the explain the evolution of our altruistic gene as a result of natural selection. In contrast to the selfish person, people who helped others were more likely to get help when they needed it most, say in attack by predators. Actually, the empirical findings on humaneness from brain sciences should not surprise us. Most of the time, a large section of the world's 7 billion people is generally kind and helpful towards others. In contrast to philosopher Hannah Arendt's characterization of ordinary people involved in Nazi crimes as banality of evil, one can call this the banality of humaneness. The banality of humaneness leads a quiet existence away from the noise and headlines created by criminal selfishness and inhuman cruelty. But what about cases when, for some reason or other, altruistic actions fueled by sympathy, doing good to others, does not bring good, but harm in return? Where your compassionate act is reciprocated with a slap on the cheek. And here, true to our first loyalty to truth, we must point out that though caring behavior is built in us, saintly behavior of turning the other cheek is not. That requires exceptional human beings, saints. Recent research seems to be showing that all of us have a reciprocity reflex that is activated in interpersonal situations. In other words, we are trying to act according to the dictums, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, I'll stab your back if you stab mine. Theorists are even talking about an exchange organ in the brain, as though a part of the brain is keeping account of debts owed and insults to be avenged. Specifically, the strategy of this exchange organ is to be nice in the first round of interaction. But after that, do to your partner whatever your partner did to you in the previous round. The exchange organ wants to repay a favor, even if the favor is an empty one. In one study, a psychologist sent Christmas card to randomly chosen people who he did not know. The great majority sent him a card back in return. An awareness of our unconscious tit for tat tendency of insult for insult, injury for injury, fairness for fairness, and very important, the bias towards fairness at the start of an interaction is helpful knowledge for all our interpersonal encounters. In day-to-day life, the reciprocity principle under which we unconsciously operate is visible everywhere. People, especially salespeople, who want something from us, try to give something to us first. Waiters placing a sweet or a song on the tray with the check get more tips than those who do. I'm aware of the suspiciousness with which an exhortation to altruism encounters, and rightly so, among large sections of our young and older people. The English poet William Blake's admonition that he who would do good to another must do it in minute particulars, general good is the plea of the scoundrel, hypocrite, and flatterer, is as true of India and other countries as in 2019 as it was of Britain when it was first made. The pointing out of benefits of altruistic caring behavior, the second element of humanness for individual well-being, are apparent. Can we also point to similar benefits on a societal level? Before I come to that question, let me say that I believe that a quickening of the altruistic impulse is evident in the wider social arena, with the flourishing of NGOs, including some on a global scale, such as the Gates Foundation, Oxfam, Amnesty International, or Doctors Without Borders, the unprecedented rise in charitable giving, which is not limited to one's own community, as has been the case earlier, but goes beyond it, is another signpost on this road. But what I want to address is a more uncomfortable question from someone who has so far been mostly in agreement with the substance of this talk, but has a niggling feeling that there is a missing piece. This interlocutor asks, if humaneness, which you define as consisting of two interrelated elements, sympathy and altruistic behavior, is such a welcome and primary part of being human, then why is it not enough in evidence in daily life? Why do we need endorsements from Buddha, Tagore, Gandhi, and the many saints from our own and other civilizations? Surely, you as a psychoanalyst must be aware of the powerful forces of desire, aggression, and narcissism that are as deeply rooted in the human psyche as humaneness, and to which they pose an unceasing threat all through life. We can all smile at Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx was an old comedian, part of the Marx brothers. So we can all smile at Groucho Marx quip, why should I think of the coming generations? What have they done for me? But doesn't it have some truth in it? Yes, I agree, I would say, that humaneness has to ripen in a field overgrown with weeds that seek to prevent its seeds from sprouting and growing into plants. As a psychoanalyst, I can contribute to the fostering of humaneness by analyzing the nature and strength of the enemy and then suggesting some countermeasures. For instance, what or who is the other we talk of in our observations on sympathy and altruism? The other is not only someone outside and separate from the self. It is not only an objective entity, but also a subjective imaginary construction superimposed on the objective other. Let me elaborate. At some point of time, very early in life, the child's I am heralds the birth of individuality. I am differentiates from all that is not I, from the other. From earliest childhood, the child is confronted with the difficulty of mastering negative emotions, rage, greed, selfishness, heedless and polymorphous sexuality. Confronted with the task of integrating contradictory representations of the self, the good, loving child, and the bad, raging one, and of the parents, the good, caretaking parent, and the hateful, frustrating one, the child's nascent ego has no other choice than to disown the bad representations as not belonging to the self, but to an uncanny other within the psyche. In other words, if otherness is part of the psyche and is its constituent from the beginning of life, then this uncanny other has a permanent residence in the psyche. The other cannot be actually eradicated by escalating hatred and violence that is directed towards it. One way we attempt to get rid of this bad other is through projection. That is, where a denigrated other outside comes to serve as the repository of unwanted aspects of the self. The most obvious example of the work of such projection is in conflict between groups and communities, where the other group becomes a reservoir, as the psychoanalyst Vamik Volkan calls it, for one's disavowed bad representations. These reservoirs, Muslims for Hindus, Arabs for Jews, Tibetans for Chinese, and vice versa, are also convenient repositories for subsequent rages and hateful feelings for which no clear-cut addressee is available. Since most of the bad representations arise from a social disapproval of the child's animality as expressed in its aggressivity, dirtiness, and unruly sexuality, it is preeminently this animality that a good self belonging to a moral community must disavow and place in the reservoir community. The pure us versus a dirty them, the association of a rival community with denigrated, often anal bodily parts and functions is commonplace in situations around the world. Dirty nigger and dirty Jew are well-known epithets in the United States. The Chinese regard Tibetans as the great unwashed, perpetually stinking of yak butter. In Rwandan radio broadcasts inciting the Hutus to massacre the Tutsis, the latter were consistently called rats and cockroaches, creatures associated with underground sewers, disgusting and dangerous vermin needing to be exterminated. And in my own study of Hindu-Muslim conflict, described in The Colors of Violence, the Hindu image of Muslim men is one of ferocity, rampant sexuality, quote, they copulate like beasts, and a dirtiness which is less a matter of bodily cleanliness and more of an inner pollution as a consequence of the consumption of tabooed foods. For Muslims, Hindu men have no control over their impulses, possess an animal cunning, and are inhumanly cruel. Berehm. Little wonder that love thy neighbor as thyself needed to be a commandment. The neighbor is potentially an antagonist, basically dangerous, and therefore to be ignored if distant enough, to be demeaned when too visible, and to be attacked when threatening to encroach. Excuse me. The primary work of increasing sympathy between antagonistic groups is internal. It must first take place in our minds. This work needs the realization that we all have a dark group within us, that our unconscious need for enemies is as deeply embedded in us as the more conscious need for friends. Our shadow side is part of our developmental heritage that can be disavowed only at the peril of it then being available to demagogues who seek to harness it to the goal of divisiveness and differentiation. It is a further realization that our developmental heritage from our childhood is not our fate, that we need not act according to our darker dictates. It is a realization that between loving and hating your neighbor, there's a range of choices ranging from various shades of amity to tolerance and indifference that are also available to each one of us. It is not easy to give up our prejudices that exist at a deep level of feelings, but we can at least become aware of them and try to prevent them from influencing our thinking. Only such introspection can make me immune against all those who seek to stoke my group's persecution anxiety with images of a besieged and endangered community on the verge of extinction at the hands of the other, the enemy group, even as they seek to heighten my group's narcissism by singing of its glories while ridiculing similar pretensions of the other community. How do we encourage such an introspection that fosters humaneness in large numbers of people? You might want to ask. For some, the answer will be found in religious traditions, which have developed various methods from rituals to introspective meditative techniques aimed at widening our capacity for sympathy. The Buddhist compassionate meditation, for instance, specifically addresses this capacity. Another way of increasing our sympathetic capacity may well be a constant and conscious practice of compassion till it becomes an ingrained way of approaching all living beings. That is, to be constantly heedful of the poet William Blake's admonition of doing good in minute particulars. To consistently engage in introspective practices to foster humaneness is the province of only a few. For a vast majority, what is needed is that this enterprise, defined by our icons as the core of Indian civilization, becomes an integral part of the curriculum of our schools and colleges. It is important that we realize that to successfully address the dark side of our individual and group identities that are obstacles to humaneness, we need to harness all the resources of art, music, visual, and cinematic. It is not only the message, but the medium, which is even more important in such an undertaking. For instance, the use of stories. Our species existed for more than 100,000 years before the earliest signs of literacy, and another 5,000 years would pass before the majority of humans would know how to read and write. Stories were the primary way our ancestors transmitted knowledge and values. Our brains evolved to expect stories with a particular structure, with heroes and villains, a hill to be climbed, or a battle to be fought. Although stories grip us more readily than a narration of facts, they become even more powerful if they contain emotion. In an experiment reported in Nature some years ago, two emotionally dissimilar stories were read out to experimental subjects. The first story was boring and went as follows. A boy is driving through the city with his mother to visit his father who works in a hospital. There, the boy is shown a sequence of medical treatments. The second story was more dramatic. A boy is driving through the city with his mother in a car and is grievously hurt in a car accident. He is rushed to the hospital where he is subjected to a series of medical interventions. The experimental subjects were then given a list of the hospital's treatment to read and sent home. After a week, the subjects who heard the dramatic second story remembered the treatment details better than those who had heard the first one. Only by deploying the full resources of art and its capacity to reach the deeper layers of psyche inaccessible to language alone can we move beyond the mere provision of information that has become such a disproportionate part of our education system. To look inwards is to give up the illusory clarity and excitement of thinking in black and white and embrace the color gray, the preeminent color of reality. Gray is not a color of excitement, of passion. Buddha with his Sarvam Dukkham and Freud with his promise of exchanging the sufferer's hysterical misery for common human unhappiness are both depressives, votaries of the color gray, and thus supreme realists, since reality for anyone who looks at it without blinkers is depressing. As one of the psychoanalytic schools avers, we are all paranoids, but at best may mature into depressives. Fortunately, gray is not only the color of rational thought, but has allies in our psychic depths, which I've tried to elaborate, if we would only harness them to our cause. I'm speaking of our natural human compassion, our humaneness, just as natural as our dark nature. One can only hope that the crisis of COVID also an opportunity for a significant increase in humaneness in the post-COVID world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kakar, for such a fascinating lecture covering different aspects of humanness from Indian and Western thoughts, ideas, and empirical studies. It is indeed a great pleasure for us to listen to you. Now, I would like to invite our discussant, Professor Vindhya, to just throw the light of the major points discussed by our speaker, Professor Vindhya.
Am I audible?
Yeah, ma'am.
Am I visible?
Yeah.
Am I visible also? Okay.
Yeah.
These have now become the standard opening remarks of any webinar, asking whether one is visible or audible. So once again, good afternoon to all of you. I'm really thankful for this opportunity to share a platform with Sudhir Kakar, India's foremost psychoanalyst and also a cultural commentator on our times and social life. So although this is a virtual platform and I'm not physically, sitting next to him or something like that, I'm really thankful for this opportunity. And yes, I share his concern about this particular medium being a bit unnerving, because as students of psychology, we are used to making eye contact with people. And in this case, not having eye contact is certainly a bit, rattling. So Professor Sudhir Kakar, as he was introduced, his books, Inner World, Intimate Relations, Colors of Violence, to name just a few, have illuminated facets of the Indian psyche, so to speak, shaped largely by the Hindu worldview. And in his very wide-ranging talk just now, offering insights, mapping the interior landscapes, being perceptive, combining empathy with a critique of the human condition, so to speak, which are distinctive characteristics of psychoanalytic practice. Sudhir Kakar has brought them all alive into his talk as well, which is, as I said, a very wide-ranging one, drawing from a heap of sources from Gandhi, Tagore, Hannah Arendt, and from varied sources of literature as well. Now, given the current context of COVID and the lockdown, many of us who have been involved in the nitty-gritty of relief work, scores of citizen groups who have rallied together, provided food, emergency supplies, made transport arrangements. I would like to see this particular context. I would like to read and understand Professor Sudhir Kakar's talk in this particular context of the enormous scale of relief efforts that are underway in the context of COVID, and just wish to reiterate two key points that he has so eloquently made and add my 2 paisa worth. First, the relief efforts and the stories of courage, hope, kindness, amidst all the other stories of terrible mismanagement, state apathy, and chaos, provide us with a context that for Sudhir Kakar to raise this question in psychological terms. Why do people care? Why do people help others? Why do people care? And what happens when we do? And the second point, or the second question, which is a larger one, raised by the pandemic and is germane to the after COVID series of talks organized by TISS Hyderabad, School of Public Policy and Governance, is that our ways of thinking, doing and being are, will now perhaps have to be re-envisioned in a post-COVID world. This may sound rather dramatic, but COVID compels us to think afresh on notions of care and compassion, of vulnerability, and of learning ways to tolerate uncertainty. So the pandemic, as Professor Sudhir Kakar in the end, can create an opening for us to emerge with a heightened sense of purpose about, it could be saving our environment, it could be, sustaining growth with equality, of tempering human greed, as well as increased compassion for the struggles of others. So as I said, maybe these are all very sweeping statements, but all cultures, and as he said, all religions offer alternative visions, alternative versions of resolving dilemmas of human existence. And I think, COVID offers us this opportunity to do this reflection. So coming to the first point that Professor Kakar made, why do people care? Why do people help others? There is considerable research on the psychology of compassion, or pro-social behavior, as it is very dryly referred to in social psychological research, or altruism, the term that he has employed. And psychological theories do propose that individuals have, human beings have fundamental needs for A, relatedness, which is being connected to others, B, competence, which is capable, the capability to carry out different tasks, and C, autonomy, which is the freedom to choose and to be in control of one's own actions. So when we perform acts of humaneness or compassion, it leads to satisfaction of these three basic psychological needs that in turn, as Professor Kakar said, foster higher levels of psychological well-being or subjective well-being. So in other words, engagement in pro-social behavior or altruism or compassion is actually positively associated with a sense of well-being. Now, how does this happen? Being caring and compassionate to others could facilitate the need, could facilitate the satisfaction of the need for relatedness, as pro-social behavior assumes that there is an interaction between, for want of a better word, I'm using interaction between the benefactor and the beneficiary that could bring the two together, fostering a sense of connection and closeness. I would just like to kind of slightly digress here and share a story that has been doing the rounds on WhatsApp groups recently of COVID story of a friend who reported the incident of a man walking all the way from somewhere in Karnataka, his hometown in Uttar Pradesh, I think. And on the way, somewhere close to Hyderabad, he had halted for a while, and our friend was there distributing packets of buttermilk to all the walking migrant workers. And he happened to have a conversation with this man, and he asked him why was he not getting into the trucks which were being the transport, which was being, it was paid transport, which was being arranged by some of the citizen groups there. And this man replied that he did not have the money, and so therefore he could not get into the trucks. So this man, our friend, did not have, was not carrying much cash with him, but whatever he had, he gave it to him. And he also gave him his phone number and said, after you reach home, please do tell me, that you have reached safe, or on the way also, if you need any help, please do call. After about 2 days, our friend received a call from this man saying that yes, he had reached, and how does he want the money that he gave? I think it was a mere 500 or something. How does he want the money to be returned? So, of course, our friend was very, very touched and moved by this particular incident. And he said, after all, I was just giving him a mere 500, and this man wanted to know how he, should return this money. So that picture of calm human dignity in one stroke swelled the, felled the unequal relationship that is generally between a benefactor and a beneficiary. You know, the kind of dignity that this man had. Now, coming to the second, so this is relatedness. So acts of compassion bring some kind of a connection between, the so-called the giver and the taker. Now, coming to the second need of competence, which psychological research says that acts of compassion promotes satisfaction of the need for competence, as any enactment of kind behavior, compassionate behavior, requires some kind of intentional effort on the part of the benefactor. And if we are able to contribute to another person's well-being, as our friend did in the story that I just now said, would make us feel socially competent. So it enhances our need for competence. And again, going back to these COVID stories of relief efforts, people who care, people who come forward to help, they get reinforced because of their efforts have led to someone else's well-being. And finally, the third need, performing acts of compassion could satisfy need for autonomy, as pro-social behavior is mostly autonomously motivated and enacted at the choice of the person, of the benefactor. So according to these, whole lot of psychological research, the relationship between compassion and well-being, subjective well-being, is mediated by these human needs for relatedness, competence, and autonomy. So this was with regard to the first point about why people care and what basic psychological needs are satisfied. And coming to the second point about this re-envisioning of a post-COVID world, and is it realistic? Can we hope, for compassion to be ingrained, as Professor Sudhir Kakar said, into the human psyche? Here I would perhaps say that this task of re-evaluation of course, cannot be accomplished at the level of the individual only, but also in the public spheres of politics and culture. And I would like to frame this particular problem within the justice and care perspectives. The justice perspective that Professor Kakar raised. Of course, there's considerable research on that. Much has been written about the justice perspective, both in political theory as well as in classical Western developmental theories, such as that of Pierre and Kohlberg and so on, that again emphasize on autonomy and instrumentality. But in contrast, several feminist scholars have questioned this perspective of justice, saying that it leaves little scope for conceptualizing empathy, emotion, relatedness, and the philosophy of care. So very often we find that the paradigms of justice and care are generally kind of positioned as if they are contradictory to each other. And viewed in another way, the justice and care orientations belong respectively to the individualist culture and the collectivist conceptions of culture. And it is by now well known that individualist autonomy and emphasis on rules, norms, principles are central and pervasive values in cultures such as individualist cultures such as Anglo-American, while close-knit familial relations, interdependence, and such other collectivist tendencies are found to persist in societies, like ours. And it can be argued that the justice and care perspectives are qualitatively different ways of being engaged with the world and with people around us. And but my argument is that we do have a philosophy of care etched in our close-knit, interdependent and collectivist cultures such as ours. However, there is a critical difference. as I've been saying, and as Professor Kakar referred to, we do have a philosophy of care, but our philosophy of care is embedded in a very hierarchical setup, steeped in inequalities of gender, caste, community, and so on. So such that the giving of care in our society becomes a disproportionate burden, with rights and justice generally for one section, and giving of care is considered for another. So my question is, can we democratize this philosophy of care that exists, already exists in our close-knit interdependent cultures, such that the configuration of caregiving is tempered with an understanding of rights and equality, balanced with compassion and humaneness. So democratization of the philosophy of care and contributing to thinking of a compassionate alternative to the politics of despair sometimes that we find is probably a kind of way ahead. So I do see that I have exceeded my time. So I would once again, thank Professor Sudhir Kakar for giving this opportunity to reflect. Though I'm a very, obviously a very, very small person compared to him. But one last word, I was rather curious why he used the term sympathy. Whereas I would have probably liked him to use the word empathy for its egalitarian overtones, whereas sympathy, at least to my understanding, denotes some kind of an unequal relationship. So empathy is, of course, what we read, teach, write in our classrooms, telling our students and so on. But I would have preferred him to use the word empathy rather than sympathy. So thank you very much, sir. It was indeed a pleasure listening to you. And I do hope, and of course, your writings, as I said, are seminal, foundational, to psychology and understanding of psychoanalytic practice in India. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you for that lovely and very insightful remarks. I will only answer the question you asked me before we come to the audience. The choice of sympathy was that I wanted an overarching one for feelings which can start from tolerance, which then go closer to compassion. Empathy is even the closest because it's not for the distance between two people is in those moments of empathy is close. You feel into others. So just feeling for, feeling into. Now, empathy was then this very near the summit of then the mystical union of the Unio Mystica. That is the last one to that. So sympathy was the only one I thought which might cover, although you are right that sympathy is not the right one. But mainly I think I use it because Tagore uses it. And so, because then it gives you, when I'm quoting Tagore, I can go straight to sympathy and not say he says this and I say that. So sympathy was very much because of those two considerations. Had to use some word. I could have used foreign words. So.
Yeah. Thank you.